Man, let me tell y'all something. This cat right here was the heartbeat of Memphis soul. The man behind the drums, the groove that made your head nod without you even knowing it. His name? Al Jackson Jr. They called him the human timekeeper, but somehow, outside the studio walls, he never got the shine he truly deserved. He laid down the beat for legends like Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, and Al Green. Yet most folks don't even know his story. And then boom, just like that, his life ended in a blaze of mystery. 5 bullets, a crime scene that never quite added up. So what really happened to Al Jackson? Why did one of the greatest drummers of all time remain underrated? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Man, before Al Jackson Jr. ever sat behind the drum kit that would change the sound of soul, he was just a kid coming up in Memphis. And Memphis, wasn't just any city. This was the beating heart of black music in America: gospel, blues, rhythm and blues. If you wanted to feel the soul of the South, Memphis was the spot. But back in 1935, when Al was born, life for a black family in the South was rough. Segregation was real. Jim Crow laws kept folks boxed in, and opportunities, they were slim to none. Al grew up in a world where survival meant working twice as hard just to get half as far. His parents raised him in a modest home, teaching discipline and respect, but also surrounding him with music. His father, Al Jackson Sr., was a respected musician himself. Pops led a big band that played around town, and man, that band was no joke. They swung hard, they played jazz, and they were known in the Memphis circuit. So you could say rhythm was in Al Jr.'s blood before he even picked up a pair of sticks. Picture this: a young boy sitting on the edge of a stage, eyes wide open, watching his father command the room with horns blasting, piano rolling, and drums snapping like firecrackers. That sound didn't just entertain him, it carved something deep in his soul. Al Sr. wasn't just a father, he was the blueprint. He showed little Al what it meant to hold down a groove, to keep the band together, to make music feel alive. By the time he was 5 years old, Al Jr. was already fooling around with drums. Not fancy equipment, just whatever he could get his hands on to make a rhythm. You know how some kids bang on pots and pans? Well, Al made it sound like a song. Folks around the neighborhood noticed too. They'd say, "That Jackson boy got something special." And they weren't lying. Memphis itself shaped him as much as his family did. The city was alive with sound street corners buzzing with gospel groups harmonizing, jukeboxes spilling out blues, records, churches filled with choirs that could raise the roof. Young Al soaked it all up. The discipline of church music, the raw honesty of the blues, the drive of jazz, it all mixed together inside him. And let's not forget, this was the same Memphis that would give the world Sun Records, Elvis Presley, and later Stax Records. Al was right in the middle of a musical storm that was about to blow nationwide. Now here's the wild part. While most kids his age were chasing balls or running through the streets, Al was practicing, hours on end, just him and the drums. His timing was ridiculous, even as a teenager. They called him a natural metronome, because the boy could hold tempo like a machine. No speeding up, no slowing down, just rock solid, steady. And that's a skill that would later earn him the nickname, the human timekeeper. In high school, Al didn't just play, he led. He started drumming with local bands, sometimes even filling in with his father's big band when they needed him. Imagine being barely in your teens, sitting in with grown men, and not just keeping up, but holding it down. That's how sharp he was. His confidence grew, but he wasn't cocky. He was humble, quiet, focused. That was Al. And you know how every great story has that early sign that greatness is coming? For Al, it was the way other musicians respected him. Older cats who had been on the scene for years would nod and say, "That boy's got it." He wasn't just another kid learning drums, he was a musician already, with feel, groove, and maturity beyond his age. Still, life in Memphis wasn't all music and magic. Remember, this was the 1940 period. Racism was everywhere, and opportunities for young black men were limited. The streets could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. But music gave Al a way out, a purpose, something bigger than the struggle. It kept him grounded, kept him moving forward. By the late 1940 period, Al was well known in the Memphis music circles. If there was a band gig, chances are he was behind the kit. Clubs, community events, talent shows, he played them all. And each time, his reputation grew. People talked about that young drummer with perfect timing. He didn't play flashy solos just to show off. Instead, he made the music feel good. He knew his job wasn't about spotlight, it was about holding everybody together. And that mindset, man, that's what would later make him one of the most in-demand session drummers in the world. When Al wasn't on stage, he was at home listening to records. He studied jazz greats like Max Roach and Art Blakey, and blues drummers who could make one snare hit feel like a sermon. He absorbed styles from all over but blended them into his own flavor. That flavor would later define what we now call the Memphis sound. So here you had this young black kid from Memphis, raised in a segregated South, with rhythm in his blood and a fire in his heart. Nobody knew it yet, but he was about to become the backbone of soul music, the beat behind the legends, the groove maker, the human timekeeper. And, man, the next chapter? That's where the story really starts to heat up. Because once Al Jackson Jr. hooked up with some cats named Booker T, Steve Cropper, and Duck Dunn, everything changed. By the early 1960 period, Al Jackson Jr. wasn't just another kid with a pair of drumsticks, he was already a pro on the Memphis scene. Everybody knew if you wanted a drummer who could lock in tight and never miss a beat, Al was your man. And then fate stepped in, bringing him together with some cats who were about to change music history. Booker T. Jones on organ, Steve Cropper on guitar, and Donald Duck Dunn on bass. Put them all together and what you get is Booker T. and the MGs. Now, man, let me tell you, this wasn't just a band. This was the house band for Stax Records. These guys weren't only cutting their own records, they were laying the foundation for nearly every big soul hit that came out of Memphis. And at the center of all that groove, Al Jackson, sitting behind the kit, holding it down like nobody else. When they dropped Green Onions in 1962, it was game over. That instrumental was funky, it was gritty, it was cool as hell. And a big reason it hit so hard was because of Al's drums. He didn't overplay, nah, that wasn't his style. He kept it simple, steady, and funky, making sure every snare hit, every hi-hat, every bass drum locked into place. People around the world were grooving to that record, but not everybody realized it was this quiet Memphis drummer making it tick. And that's the crazy part, man. Booker T and the MGs were groundbreaking not just for the music, but for who they were. This was one of the first racially integrated bands in America, with black and white musicians playing together at a time when segregation was still strong in the South. You had Al and Booker T as the black members, Cropper and Dunn as the white members, and together they didn't just make hits, they made history. In a divided world, their music said, "Soul has no color. That's powerful, man." Al fit right in because his personality matched his playing. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't about the spotlight. He was steady, dependable, the rock in the middle of the storm. You could build a whole band around his groove, and that's exactly what Stax did. When artists came in to record Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Sam and Dave Al was the one setting the tone, making sure the rhythm was undeniable. And you know what's wild? Musicians loved him because he made them sound better. Singers could relax because they knew Al had their back. Guitarists and bassists could stretch out because Al kept the pocket tight. He was like the glue, man, the glue that held Memphis soul together. But let's be real, at that time, the drummer wasn't the one getting headlines. Frontman got the fame, but Al was content with the groove. He didn't need to shine in the spotlight. He was the spotlight for anybody who knew music. Booker T himself once said that Al's timing was so precise, you could set your watch to it. That's respect on another level. So yeah, by the mid-1960 period, Al Jackson Jr. was more than just a local kid who could play. He was a founding member of one of the most important bands in American music history. And even though his name wasn't always in big lights, his beat was pumping through radios, jukeboxes, and turntables across the world. But man, that was just the beginning, because when Al stepped out of the MGs and started putting his stamp on records for every artist who walked into Stax, his influence went from big to legendary. Man, if Booker T and the MGs put Al Jackson Jr. on the map, then Stax Records turned him into a legend whether the world knew it or not. See, the MGs weren't just a band doing their own thing, they were the house band at Stax. And that meant every time a singer walked through those studio doors, Al was there behind the kit, laying down the groove. We're talking Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Wilson Pickett, Rufus Thomas, and later, Al Green. You name it, Al Jackson was drumming for them. That Memphis sound that everybody loved, that raw, gritty, emotional soul. Al's hands and feet were literally the heartbeat of it. Here's the crazy thing. Man, he wasn't just playing a beat. He was crafting it. He had this way of keeping things tight but still making it swing. His snare cracked like thunder, his hi-hat whispered like silk, and his bass drum drove the whole train forward. Other drummers might have tried to show off, but Al understood the assignment: make the song feel good. And trust me, he nailed it every single time. Think about a track like I Can't Turn You Loose by Otis Redding. The energy, the drive, it's Al Jackson keeping that fire burning under Otis's voice. Or Hold On, I'm Comin' by Sam and Dave. Man, that groove is pure Al, steady as a rock but funky enough to move the whole room. And when Al teamed up with producer Willie Mitchell to cut those smooth Al Green records in the 1970 period, forget about it. Let's Stay Together wouldn't hit the same without that pocket Al built. Inside the studio, he was known as the human timekeeper. No metronome needed, just put Al on the kit and everything locked in. Engineers loved him because his consistency made recording sessions smooth. Artists loved him because he gave them confidence. And other musicians? They looked at him like he was the backbone of the entire operation. But here's where the underrated part kicks in. The singers became stars. Otis, Sam and Dave, Al Green, they were household names. But the man who powered those records, the one who gave them that timeless groove, stayed in the background. Fans knew the songs, but not the drummer. That's the injustice, man. Al was everywhere, but his name wasn't. Still, musicians knew. They knew he was the truth. James Gadson, Clyde Stubblefield, Jabo Stark's cats who defined funk and soul drumming, they all respected Al. He was in that rare group where one simple snare hit told you exactly who was playing. That's how deep his identity was in the music. So by the end of the 1960 period and rolling into the 1970 period, Al Jackson Jr. wasn't just keeping time, he was defining an era. Every groove he touched became part of the DNA of soul music. He was in demand, loved by artists, respected by peers. But outside the studio walls, he was still underrated, still overlooked by the mainstream. And man, that sets the stage for the next part of his journey when the world finally caught on to just how important he really was. By the mid-1960 period, Stax Records was on fire. And right in the middle of it all was Al Jackson Jr. Behind those studio walls on East Macklemore Avenue in Memphis, magic was happening every single day. And if you peel back the layers of those legendary tracks, you'll always find Al's groove sitting steady at the core. When Booker T and the MGs exploded with Green Onions, that was just the start. The band wasn't just charting their own hits, they became the heartbeat of an entire label. Stax was pumping out classics left and right, and Al was the timekeeper who made sure it all held together. Think about it, songs like In the Midnight Hour by Wilson Pickett, Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding, Knock on Wood by Eddie Floyd. Every one of them had that unmistakable feel that only Al could deliver. And here's the thing, the Stax sound wasn't polished like Motown. Nah, man. Motown was slick, refined, tailored for crossover radio. Stax was raw, gritty, straight from the gut. And a big reason for that was Al's drumming. He didn't just keep tempo, he gave the music character. He could make a song strut, make it cry, make it explode with energy. One crack of his snare and you knew it was Memphis soul. The MGs themselves weren't sitting on the sidelines either. They were stars in their own right. Instrumentals like Time Is Tight and Hip Hug Her became soundtracks of a generation. And guess what? Al was the one steering the ship. While Booker T's organ gave the flavor, Cropper's guitar gave the bite, and Duck Dunn's bass gave the groove, it was Al's drums that locked everything into place. Without him, that whole structure falls apart. By this time, musicians across the country started paying attention. They called him the human timekeeper, not as a nickname but as a fact. His pocket was so deep you could get lost in it, and artists who came to Stax knew they were getting something special, because if Al Jackson was on the session, the track was gonna hit, period. But here's the wild contradiction. While Al's playing was literally shaping the sound of an era, he wasn't being celebrated like the frontmen he supported. People screamed for Otis, cheered for Sam and Dave, lined up to see Isaac Hayes. But who was making their songs move? Who was giving them that power? Al Jackson Jr. The man was the MVP, but he stayed in the shadows. Still, the influence couldn't be denied. Even across the Atlantic, British bands were eating up Stax records, studying that groove. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, they were all tuned in to what was happening in Memphis. And that means, indirectly, Al Jackson's beat was shaping not just American soul, but global rock and pop music, too. So yeah, man, these were the glory days. Al was at the top of his game, the MGs were world-renowned, and Stax was a cultural force. Memphis wasn't just a city anymore, it was a sound. And Al Jackson Jr.? He was the one keeping the clock ticking on it all. But fame and success don't always come with peace. Behind the music, storms were brewing. Storms that would test Al in ways nobody could have predicted. Now here's where the story gets real, man. By the late 1960 period, Al Jackson Jr. had already proven himself as one of the most solid drummers on the planet. Musicians knew it. Producers knew it. Anybody who ever set foot in Stax knew it. But outside those walls, he wasn't getting the recognition he deserved. And that's the underrated tragedy right there. Think about it, people called James Brown's drummers like Clyde Stubblefield and Jabo Starks legends. And they are, no doubt. They got nicknames, interviews, and love from the music world. But Al, he was on just as many iconic records, if not more, and yet he stayed in the background. Folks didn't see him as the star because he wasn't the one with the mic. But man, without his groove, half those hits wouldn't even exist. Musicians, though they gave him his flowers, they nicknamed him the human timekeeper. Not because it sounded cool, but because it was true. His timing was flawless, his pocket was unshakable. If you were in the studio, and Al was behind the kit, you knew the track was going to come out right. No second takes, no fixing in the mix. He locked it in from the jump. That's a gift only a few drummers in history ever had. But here's the crazy part. While the industry was quick to celebrate flashy frontmen or charismatic stars, they barely shined a light on Al. He was part of a racially integrated band at a time when that itself was revolutionary, but even then, Booker T was the face. Steve Cropper was the songwriter. Duck Dunn was the character. Al? He was the backbone. But the backbone rarely gets the headlines. And that's the injustice, man. He was essential to the Memphis sound, but he never became a household name. Imagine walking down the street in 1970 and asking folks about Al Jackson. Most wouldn't know him. But play them Dock of the Bay or Let's Stay Together, and they'd know every note. They just didn't know the man who made those notes breathe. Now, let's keep it real. Part of that was Al's personality. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't out here talking big in interviews or pushing himself as a star. He was humble, almost quiet. He let the drums do the talking. But man, when the drums are speaking louder than most singers, you'd think history would put your name in bold letters, right? Instead, history often put him in the fine print. And that's why we're here, telling his story. Because without Al Jackson Jr., there is no Memphis groove. Without Al, Stax doesn't sound like Stax. Without Al, Otis doesn't soar the same, Sam and Dave don't punch the same, Al Green doesn't glide the same. So while the world danced to his beat, they didn't always recognize the man behind it. That's the bittersweet part of his breakthrough. Celebrated by insiders, but underrated by the masses. And it leaves us with one big question. Why wasn't Al Jackson Jr. ever given his rightful place alongside the greatest? And sadly, man, the next chapter of his life would only make that question even louder. Because just when it seemed like he was on top of the world, the shadows of conflict and tragedy started creeping in. Man, for all the success Al Jackson Jr. was having behind the drum kit, his personal life wasn't nearly as steady as his groove. And that's the thing with so many of these underrated legends on stage, they were untouchable, but off stage, life could get real messy, real fast. Al was married to a woman named Barbara. And let's just say, their relationship was complicated, to put it lightly. On the outside, it looked like Al was living the dream, a top-session drummer, steady income, recognition from musicians everywhere. But behind closed doors, the marriage was full of tension. Friends would say they argued a lot, that Al wasn't happy at home. And the wildest part? Barbara once actually shot him. Yeah, man. Let that sink in. His own wife pulled a gun and shot him in the chest. Now, you'd think that would be the end of things, right? Most people would have walked away and never looked back. But not Al. For reasons only he fully understood, he stayed. Even after recovering from that gunshot wound, he kept living in the same house with her. And that's something fans and family have never stopped questioning. Why go back to a woman who tried to kill you? Some say it was love. Some say it was denial. Others believe it was the kind of complicated loyalty that musicians sometimes carry, the idea that you just keep pushing forward, even through the pain. What made it even harder was the pressure from the music business itself. Being a session player at Stax meant constant work, long hours, and tours that pulled him away from home. Imagine holding down the beat for the biggest stars of your time, but then coming home to chaos. That balance is tough for anybody. And Al wasn't the kind of man to air out his problems in public, so most people didn't even realize the storm he was living in. But those close to him noticed. They saw the stress on his face. They heard him talk about wanting to move into his own apartment, to finally separate from Barbara. Some reports even say he had plans to leave, that he was ready to start fresh. But man, life doesn't always let you flip the page so easily. The tension in his marriage bled into everything else. While his playing never suffered, he was still rock solid in the studio. You gotta wonder what it did to him emotionally. Holding down a beat is one thing, but holding down a life when you're wounded at home, that's a whole different kind of pressure. And here's the kicker. This drama didn't just disappear after the shooting. It lingered, like a shadow following him everywhere. People in Memphis whispered about it. Other musicians shook their heads in disbelief. How could Al go back? They asked. But the truth is, nobody really knew what kept him tied to Barbara. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was just that human thing of not wanting to let go, even when you know you should. So yeah, while Al Jackson Jr. was conquering the world with his music, his personal life was fragile, dangerous even. And that fragility set the stage for the darkest chapter of his story. Because the problems at home didn't just stay at home, they would one day spill over in a way that shocked everyone who loved him. Man, if Al Jackson Jr.'s marriage already sounded like something out of a movie, then his death? That was straight up a crime thriller nobody could have scripted. And the wildest part? To this day, people are still debating what really went down. It was the 1st of October 1975. Al was 39 years old, still in his prime, still laying down grooves for Stax and other projects. Just a few weeks earlier, he had been working with Booker T and the MGs again, even talking about new tours and recordings. Musically, he had plenty left in the tank. But that night, at his home in Memphis, everything came crashing down. The official story says that Al walked into his house and was confronted by a supposed intruder. Shots were fired, 5 of them straight into his body. He didn't survive. Just like that, one of the greatest drummers of all time was gone. The world lost the beatmaker behind Memphis Soul, and fans were left in shock. But man, the details didn't add up. First off, the so-called robbery didn't make sense. Nothing valuable was taken. His wallet, his jewelry, they were all left behind. The house wasn't ransacked. Nothing looked like a typical break-in. And think about it. If it was a random burglar, why shoot him 5 times? That's not a robbery. That's an execution. Then there's Barbara, his wife. Remember, this was the same woman who had shot him before and somehow convinced him to stay. On the night of his death, Barbara told police that Al had been killed by a robber who forced her to tie herself up. But a lot of folks didn't buy that story. Some pointed to the fact that Barbara was romantically linked to another man at the time, a Memphis police officer no less. That connection made people wonder if the whole thing had been orchestrated. And man, the rumors spread like wildfire. Friends, musicians, even fans started piecing together their own theories. Some believed Barbara set him up. Some thought the boyfriend in law enforcement helped cover things up. Others believed it was a hit, maybe connected to money, maybe to personal drama we'll never fully know. What everybody agreed on, though, was that the robbery gone wrong explanation was just too neat, too simple. The case never gave people closure. Nobody was ever properly charged or convicted in relation to Al's death. And that's the most frustrating part. A man who gave so much to music, who left his rhythm stamped on generations, didn't even get justice in the end. His death became one more tragic mystery in a long line of musicians whose lives ended under strange circumstances. And let's keep it real, man. This wasn't just about losing a drummer. This was about losing the heartbeat of Memphis. When news spread that Al Jackson Jr. had been killed, the whole city felt it. Musicians cried, fans mourned, and the soul community lost one of its anchors. Booker T, Cropper, Dunn, all of them were devastated. They knew they hadn't just lost a friend, They'd lost the one man who could hold their groove together. So here we are, all these years later, and people are still asking, what really happened to Al Jackson? Was it betrayal? Was it corruption? Was it just bad luck? The truth may never come out. But one thing's for sure, his death was as haunting and mysterious as his life was steady and dependable. And that's the cruel irony, man. The human timekeeper's clock was stopped, not by nature, not by time, but by bullets and shadows. Man, when you talk about legacies in music, some names shine bright like neon lights. But with Al Jackson Jr., it's a little different. His legacy isn't about flashy headlines or center stage moments. It's about that steady heartbeat that still pulses through soul, funk, and even hip-hop today. His name might not be known by every casual fan, but his sound, oh, you've heard it. You've felt it. That's the mark of a true legend. Let's start with Memphis. You can't talk about the city's sound without putting Al right at the core. Stax Records became a cultural monument because of the records it produced, but underneath all those hits was the rhythm Al created. His drumming defined what the world now calls the Memphis sound. That tight snare, that deep pocket, that balance of grit and smoothness, it was his signature. When people talk about why Stax felt so different from Motown, they always mention the rawness, the groove. That rawness came from Al Jackson Jr., but it didn't stop in the 1960 or 1970 period. His playing has been sampled, copied, and studied by generations that came after him. Hip-hop producers especially fell in love with the grooves Al laid down. Those breakbeats, those steady patterns, man, they became the building blocks for beats in the 1980 and 1990 period. Even if young fans didn't know his name, they were vibing to his influence every time a DJ spun a record built on a Stax drum track. And let's not forget the greats who praised him while he was alive. Elvis Presley himself, during a few recording sessions, called Al one of the best drummers he'd ever heard. Al Green? He openly said his smooth ballads wouldn't have soared the same without Al's drumming. Otis Redding built his fiery stage presence on the foundation Al gave him. That's the thing, so many stars leaned on Al's beat, and in doing so, they built timeless careers. The respect from his peers was enormous. Musicians still talk about Al in hushed tones, like he was the guy you measured yourself against. Other drummers admired the way he never overplayed. He didn't need to add fancy rolls or fills to prove himself. One rim shot from Al could cut through a track and make it unforgettable. That restraint, that discipline, is why they called him the human timekeeper. His influence stretched far beyond soul, too. Rock bands in the United Kingdom were tuned in to what Stax was doing. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, all of them were fans. In fact, the Stones were so inspired by Stax grooves that they modeled some of their recordings on that sound. And what was at the core of that inspiration? Al's drumming. His style shaped not only soul but also seeped into rock, pop, and funk on a global scale. What's heartbreaking, though, is how underrated he still is. You'll hear people talk about Clyde Stubblefield, Bernard Purdie, or John Bonham when naming iconic drummers, and they deserve the credit. But how often do people mention Al Jackson Jr.? Not enough. And yet, if you strip those names away and look at the DNA of modern rhythm, Al's fingerprints are everywhere. That's why this channel's Celebrity Underrated has to tell his story. Because the mainstream forgot, but we won't. His family, too, has carried his memory with pride. In later years, his grandchildren even commented online about how much it meant to see people still talk about him, still play his music, still recognize the impact he had. To them, he wasn't just a drummer, he was a grandfather, a man who left behind love as well as rhythm. And hearing their voices makes his story even more powerful, because it reminds us that legends aren't just musicians, they're family, they're human beings. And let's talk about Stax Museum in Memphis. Walk through those halls, and Al's spirit is alive in every corner. His drum kit, his photos, his sound, it's part of the permanent history there. Fans from around the world come to Memphis to learn about this music. And when they do, they meet Al Jackson Jr., the man who held it all together. You know what's crazy, though? His influence is so strong that even drummers today still study his playing like it's a textbook. They'll say, how did Al get that snare sound? How did he stay so steady without rushing or dragging? They analyze his grooves, break them down, try to copy them. But the truth is, you can't copy soul. Al had something that came from inside, from his upbringing, his culture, his city. That's why his beat still feels alive, even decades after his death. So yeah, man, his life ended too soon, taken under circumstances that still feel wrong, still feel unfair. But his beat never stopped. Every time you hear Let's Stay Together or Soul Man or Dock of the Bay, you're hearing Al Jackson Jr. Every time a hip-hop producer chops up a Stax break, you're hearing Al. Every time a young drummer studies that pocket groove and tries to figure out how to play inside the beat instead of on top of it, you're hearing Al. That's legacy, man. Not just a name on a record, not just a credit in the liner notes, but a rhythm that refuses to die, a sound that still moves people, even if they don't know the man behind it. And that's why, even though history underrated him, we can't. His name belongs with the greatest. His beat belongs forever. Man, when you step back and look at the story of Al Jackson Jr., it almost doesn't feel real. Here was a guy who gave the world its heartbeat, who made entire generations move, and yet his own name never got the same spotlight as the voices he carried. That's the crazy contradiction he was, the human timekeeper, steady as a rock, but history didn't always keep time with him. Think about it. From his early days in Memphis, soaking up the sound of gospel and blues, to joining up with Booker T and the MGs and changing the whole direction of American music, Al was always there. He wasn't chasing fame, he wasn't out there trying to be the front man. He just wanted the music to feel right. And because of that, the music we know today, the soul, the funk, even pieces of hip-hop and rock owe him everything. But man, life wasn't fair. Fame and fortune didn't protect him from heartbreak at home, from personal struggles, or from that tragic night in 1975 when bullets silenced the beat too soon. 5 shots, a story that never quite added up, and no real justice to give his family closure. That's not just tragedy, that's injustice. And it makes you wonder, how many other legends got written out of the spotlight just because they weren't the ones holding the mic? Here's the thing. Though Al's legacy isn't gone, it's right here, every time a DJ drops a breakbeat built on a Stax groove. It's alive every time you hear Let's Stay Together or Soul Man, and you feel that pocket so deep you can't help but nod your head. It's in the halls of the Stax Museum, in the words of his family, in the memories of musicians who knew they were blessed just to play with him. His body may be gone, but his rhythm never stopped. And that's why we gotta ask the hard question. Do you think Al Jackson Jr. deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest drummers of all time? Man, for me, the answer's clear, but I want to hear from y'all. Drop it in the comments. Should his name sit right up there with the likes of Clyde Stubblefield, Bernard Purdie, or even John Bonham? Or was he in a league all his own? Let's talk about it. Because his story isn't just about music, it's about recognition, about giving flowers to someone who deserved them while he was still here. And here's the part that hits me the most. For all his humility, for all his quiet strength, Al Jackson Jr. changed the sound of the world without most people even knowing it. That's the definition of being underrated. But man, underrated doesn't mean unimportant. Sometimes it means you were so good at what you did, people forgot to stop and say your name. So let's say his name, Al Jackson Jr., the human timekeeper, the groove master, the heartbeat of Memphis. He may not have been the one standing in the front with the microphone, but without him, the music would have fallen apart. His story is tragic, yes. It's mysterious, yes. But above all, it's inspiring. Because even when the world overlooked him, he kept playing. Even when life hit him hard, he kept giving us that rhythm. And that's the lesson, man. Life might not always give you the credit you deserve. Sometimes you're the one in the background, holding everything together while someone else shines. But that doesn't make you any less great. Al Jackson Jr. proved that. His beat is eternal. His groove is forever. So rest in peace to one of the greatest, most underrated drummers of all time. And to everybody watching, keep his name alive. Play the records. Share the story. And remember, his name may not shine in lights, but his beat will echo forever.